I'm Teisha Bader in for Mark Golub, and in the news, a massive trove of Nazi artifacts found in Argentina, efforts to deport a former Nazi guard out of the United States, and the death earlier this month of a convicted Nazi that was supposed to go to jail for his crimes but died while appealing his sentence. Dr. Efraim Zuroff is the chief Nazi hunter of the Simon Wiesenthal Center. He served as the first director of the center in Los Angeles in 1978, and in 1980 served as a researcher for the U.S. Justice Department's Office of Special Investigations, preparing cases against Nazi war criminals living in the U.S. In 1986, he rejoined the Wiesenthal Center and is director of their Jerusalem office. He joins us now via Skype from Israel to discuss these recent stories and share his perspective. Welcome, Dr. Zuroff. It is truly an honor to speak with you.
Thank you very much, Teisha.
Thank you. So there are a number of items in the news just this month about Nazi war criminals, but let's start with this discovery just announced by Argentina of this very large collection of Nazi artifacts found near Buenos Aires, where many Nazis, of course, fled to after the Holocaust. The collection was reportedly analyzed by Interpol and includes some truly disturbing items like medical devices that we can only assume were used by the Nazis in the death camps. What do you think the significance of this collection is?
Well, I think it clearly underscores the important role played by Argentina in granting a haven to numerous and, in some cases, very prominent Nazi war criminals. Today we know, actually we've known for some time as a result of the excellent research of an Argentinian journalist named Goni, that Argentina actually went out looking for such people in an effort to bring as many as possible of them to Argentina where they were granted a haven. And given the horrendous crimes committed by people like Joseph Mengele, Adolf Eichmann, Edward Rushman, Walter Kutschmann, and others, this is so offensive, this is so outrageous. And here we have another example of a collection, obviously by one of these people, or somewhat sympathetic to these people.
Now that's interesting. That's the first time I've heard that Argentina, as you say, went out of its way and sort of courted these people to come to their country. What was the motivation, or how did they go about doing that? Do you have any idea about that?
Yes, we know all the details. The book by Goni called The Real Odessa is a terrific historical account of how this happened. And there are several factors involved here. One is the fact that Juan Perón, who was the head of state in Argentina, was sympathetic to the Germans, and there were many people in Argentina sympathetic to the Nazis. And believe it or not, Perón had this notion that he wanted to raise the intellectual, scientific, and cultural level of his country by bringing German immigrants, by bringing German fugitives, really, to come live in Argentina. And as I said, given their record and what they had done, I mean, this is so absurd, but that's the reality. Now, the way that it was done was actually a committee was set up to coordinate this effort. So in other words, it's not by accident that these people came to Argentina, or that Argentina admitted the largest number of Nazi war criminals. Keep in mind that Argentina was not the only South American country which granted a haven to Nazi war criminals. Chile did so. Walter Rauff, the head of the technical department of the Reich Security Main Office, the person who devised the gas fans that were used at Chelmno, for example, death camp, and were used on the Eastern Front, in which hundreds of thousands of Jews were murdered. He was a person who lived in Chile. Klaus Barbie made it to Bolivia, Franz Stangl and others, Wagner, his deputy at Sobibor, and others made it to Brazil. And of course, there was always Paraguay, which was run by the dictator Alfredo Stroessner, who was a well-known sympathizer of the Nazis. But Argentina excelled because Argentina invested the most effort to find such people and bring them to Argentina.
Interesting. Let's get to these cases in the news recently of several convicted Nazi war criminals and the challenges which I know you face in actually seeing that they serve jail time. Just last week, we covered in the daily news update that we do here on JBS the story of 92-year-old Jaki Pali, I'm not sure if I'm saying his name correctly, who was a guard at Trowinki in Poland in 1943, where 6,000 Jews were murdered. Can you tell me a little bit about that case?
In order to understand what happened in this case, I have to go back to the background regarding the legal measures that the United States decided to take against the Nazi war criminals residing in America.
Okay.
When the Americans discovered that among the refugees who had flocked to the United States after World War II, there were many people who had assisted the Nazis, collaborated with the Nazis, Nazi war criminals, etc., they faced the following dilemma. These people could not be prosecuted in the United States for their crimes because the crimes were committed outside the United States and the victims were not Americans. In order to be able to prosecute them on criminal charges, that would have required a change of the Constitution. And that, as you probably understand, is not something Americans like to do. So what could they do? On the one hand, they couldn't allow them to continue living in the United States. Some of them were really big war criminals. Others, not that big, but nonetheless had helped the Nazis. So the Americans did what I half facetiously call the Al Capone compromise. In other words, as many people know, the federal government wanted to prosecute Al Capone on charges of racketeering and murder, but ultimately put him on trial for tax evasion, and in that manner was able to put him in jail. So in these cases, what the Americans could do was prosecute these people for lying on their immigration and naturalization applications. In other words, when these individuals wanted to emigrate to the United States, almost all of them were living in displaced persons camps in Germany and Austria. They were asked specific questions, which, if answered honestly, would have barred their entry. In other words, if Ivan Demjanjuk would have said, I served as an armed SS guard at the Sobibor death camp in Poland, he obviously would not have been admitted to the United States. And the same is true for Yakov Pali and all of these people who served the Nazis in different capacities. But they lied. Now, the punishment for this violation of immigration, and later those who applied for citizenship, and many of them obtained citizenship, were asked the same questions, and they usually told the same lies, was that they could be stripped of their American citizenship and they could be ordered deported. And the United States government was extremely successful in this effort, and I believe that I think 75 individuals lost their citizenship. Many of them were deported. But in recent years, a new problem developed in cases in which the government was able to obtain a deportation order, but no country was willing to accept the person whom they had, gotten a deportation order against. And Yakov Pali is one such case. In other words, there's no country willing to accept him, and under those circumstances, he has remained in the United States, which is really a tragedy in a sense, because the American government made an effort to strip this person of his citizenship and to get him deported. But in the meantime, he's sitting there living in Queens, and there's not much that they can do. There's no country that's willing to accept him. Now, there was a similar situation initially in the Demjanjuk case, because the United States government, after Demjanjuk had regained his citizenship, which is a whole long story in itself, after being expelled from Israel, because it turns out he wasn't the Ivan the Terrible of Treblinka, but had been an armed SS guard in the Sobibor death camp. So the American Office of Special Investigations, as it was called then, today it's the Office of Special Prosecutions, again had him denaturalized and obtained a deportation order against Ivan Demjanjuk. But no government was willing to take him, because at this point in time, there were no witnesses who could testify as to his crimes in Sobibor. And this was a problem in Poland, which was one country where it would have made sense to have him deported, since the Sobibor death camp was in Poland. In Germany, it was a problem because according to German law, up to that point, no one, in order to prosecute a Nazi war criminal, the prosecutors had to prove that they had committed a specific crime against a specific victim and that this crime was motivated by racial hatred, which is almost impossible to prove, by the way, at this point in time, 70 years, more than 70 years after the end of World War II. But in any event, two lawyers who worked at the Central Office for the Clarification of Nazi War Crimes, Thomas Walter and Kirsten Getze, together with a German law professor named Cornelius Nestler, came up with a strategy that could facilitate Demjanjuk's extradition to stand trial on criminal charges for his service in Sobibor in Germany. And the theory that they advanced, and their strategy was the following. The death camps, and Sobibor was one of the 6 death camps, their primary purpose was the mass murder of innocent civilians. So in other words, any person who served there could be prosecuted, not for murder or mass murder, but for accessory to murder, because their service, in essence, facilitated the murder of individuals. They didn't have to be named, they didn't have to be a specific crime, but this was the theory, and on that basis, the Germans asked for the extradition of Ivan Demjanjuk in, I believe, 2009. He arrived in Germany or maybe 2008, 2009, and he was put on trial in Munich. Trial began in October 2009 and concluded in May 2011, and Demjanjuk was convicted of accessory to murder. Now, this was a very important precedent, because this meant that any person who served in a Nazi death camp, and again, there were 6 of these camps, which are concentration camps with the apparatus for mass annihilation. We're talking about Auschwitz-Birkenau, which was, of course, the largest, had the most victims, Treblinka, Belzec, Chelmno, Sobibor, and Majdanek. But by the way, it also meant that any person who served in the Einsatzgruppen, in special killing squads that operated in the areas of the Soviet Union and murdered close to 1.5 million Jews during the years 41 to 43, could also be put on trial. And the minute that Demjanjuk was convicted, the German authorities began looking for people who had served in the death camps and had never been prosecuted, and for those who served in the Einsatzgruppen.
Right, and I want to get back to Demjanjuk in 1 second. Let me just interrupt you for a moment. Can what you're speaking about, that accessory to murder charge, be used in the Pali case? And therefore, do you think there's a chance that Germany or Poland might accept him and that he might actually be deported from the U.S.?
That charge does not apply to Travnicki.
Oh, because it's not one of the 6 death camps that you mentioned. I see.
Okay, that's the problem.
Okay.
It could, for example, apply in the case of Helmut Oberlander in Canada, who the Canadians have not succeeded in getting rid of him yet, even though he's been stripped of his Canadian citizenship, then he got it back, then he was stripped again. But so far, for some reason, the Germans have not chosen to seek his extradition. He served with Einsatzgruppe D, which are the ones that carried out mass murders in southern Ukraine, in the area of Odessa, etc. But in any event, the German authorities started looking for people who fit the description that I presented.
Yes.
In the beginning, they found 51 individuals who had served in Auschwitz, 17 who had served in Majdanek. But in the meantime, they had not found any person who served in the Einsatzgruppen. We actually prepared a list of 80 people who served in the Einsatzgruppen who were born 1920 or later. Only 8 of them were alive as of a year and a half ago, and we're waiting to hear when and whether they'll be prosecuted.
Okay, let's get back to Demjanjuk for 1 moment. So he was convicted, major achievement, accomplishment. However, he died in 2012, did not serve. He actually never went to jail, and according to legal records at least, it is written that, written down legally, he is, quote unquote, innocent or died an innocent man because he was in the process of appeal. Of course, that is just a technicality. He was obviously convicted in a court of law, but never served actual jail time, died before he could do that. And of course, I know that this is a challenge you face as these Nazi war criminals are in their 80s, they're in their 90s. They often are sometimes deemed to be too ill to even stand trial. How do you cope with that frustration, and how do you reconcile that information when you're trying to, obviously the court victory is huge, but you want to see the person actually behind bars doing the time for the crimes that they committed?
Okay, first of all, I have to explain something. Demjanjuk did sit in jail, but he sat, first of all, as you know, he was in jail in Israel for more than 7 years. Second of all, he sat in jail in Germany awaiting his trial for almost 2 years, I think slightly more than 2 years. The problem was that when he appealed after his conviction, he did not have to go to jail. And he actually died awaiting for his appeal to be heard.
I see.
So he sit in jail. It wasn't a total, wipeout, so to speak.
Right.
There's no question that, listen, first of all, I have to say, to be perfectly honest, my job is one full of frustrations. We have people dying on us in the middle of investigations, right before a trial, right after a trial, when there was an appeal. I mean, I've encountered practically every type of frustration imaginable. But okay, listen, we have no choice, and it's important to continue and to pursue these cases. And as long as these cases are being pursued, these people can't, just die in peace and tranquility that they don't deserve.
So talk about that a bit. Operation Last Chance. This is the campaign of the Wiesenthal Center, your campaign of achieving justice and finding these Nazi war criminals, bringing them to trial, even if they are in their last days of life. You wrote an article recently for the Jerusalem Post called "Full Justice Requires Punishment." So what do you say to those people who tell you, look, Dr. Zuroff, these are old men. They committed these crimes decades ago when they were young men. They're now frail. They're old. They're sick. What is the point of putting them behind bars? What is the point of dragging them through this process? What do you answer to those people who question this unrelenting pursuit of justice?
I answer the following. Number one, the passage of time in no way diminishes the guilt of the killers. Number two, the fact that someone has eluded justice and reached an elderly age does not turn a murderer, or in some cases even a mass murderer, into a righteous Gentile. The third point is that we owe it to the victims to try and find the people who turned innocent men, women, and children into victims simply because they were classified as enemies of the Reich. The fourth point is that these trials serve a very important purpose in terms of the fight against Holocaust denial and Holocaust distortion. They also send a very powerful message, I think, that if you harm Jews or if you harm people, innocent people, even decades later, there'll be efforts to hold you accountable. Now, I would also add two other things, which is that these are the last people on earth who deserve any sympathy, because they had absolutely no sympathy for their victims, some of whom were actually older than they are today. And I've never had a case that I dealt with personally, frankly, in which a Nazi war criminal ever expressed any regret or any remorse.
That's interesting. I read that you wrote that, and I don't know if I was surprised by that, but I was sort of struck by that comment. And you still maintain that? You still have not ever heard any remorse in your personal dealings?
Okay. Reinhold Hanning did express remorse.
Mm-hmm.
He did apologize. But I didn't find him, to be honest. And I didn't have to pursue the case that much myself, because it's a case that the Germans found and they pursued it. And they have, in Germany today, there is political will to bring these people to justice, which is the absolute absolutely necessary prerequisite for Nazi war criminals to be put on trial in the 21st century.
Yes, and Hanning is actually one of those cases that we mentioned, that we've covered in the news also. He died at the beginning of this month. I think it was just before he could go to jail. And, again, that was a case where it kind of fell short. However, his conviction and his sentencing by a German court to 5 years in prison for his role as an accessory in the murder of at least 170,000 people in the Auschwitz death camp in Poland was, of course, a major achievement.
It's a very important statement, and it's important for the survivors and for the people who came, for the plaintiffs, some who testified at the trial. All this is very important. Obviously, if there is no punishment, then it sort of lacks, a certain element. And that's what I wrote in the article. In other words, I said, if I have to choose between no trials or trials with convictions and no punishment, obviously I prefer that there be trials even if there won't be punishment. But having said that, it's important to send these people to prison, even if only symbolically.
Absolutely. Another case, Oskar Groening, he was known as the bookkeeper of Auschwitz and also convicted by a German court in 2015, sentenced to prison as well. What is happening in that case now? I know that he has appealed. That appeal was rejected. So what is the status at the moment in that case?
The appeal was rejected in November of 2016, last year. But they, in the meantime, have not found a suitable facility for him. But apparently they're on the verge of finding one. They've just found one. But again, look, we're already towards the end of June. That's 8 months since his appeal was rejected. So, we're talking about cases of people very elderly. Every day that they're not in jail brings them closer to eluding justice, full justice. And this, again, I'll add this to the list of my frustrations, and those frustrations, as I explained, are many. Anyone who reads my book, Operation Last Chance, is probably sitting there scratching their heads, wondering how we do this despite all the frustrations and the obstacles.
Well, it certainly is commendable that, day in and day out, you're fighting this fight. And what actually happens, I know the campaign, part of the campaign is that you do offer financial rewards to people who come forward and give you information that leads to the arrest and conviction of Nazi war criminals. So who are these people that are contacting you? Are these Holocaust survivors? Are these relatives of the suspected Nazis? Who actually is coming forward with information?
It's an amazingly heterogeneous group, all sorts of people. In some cases, it's actually relatives of people who suspect that their relatives are Nazi war criminals. But that only happens in Germany, for example. It's never happened anywhere else, or almost never. Other people encounter someone whom they suspect. I have to say, to be honest, much of the information is totally worthless. But for some reason, people feel a need. I can give you a example. People will tell me all of a sudden I'll get a message from someone who tells me that while he was a backpacker in Peru, in the Amazon area of Peru, 40 years ago, in a place whose name he doesn't even remember, the locals were talking about the German. Okay? And he suspects this person might be a Nazi war criminal. He has no idea if he's alive more than 40 years after he was there. He doesn't remember the name of the place, but he felt some need to unburden himself.
So you get information as vague as that, and then I'm sure you do also get information with specifics. As you said, if it's a relative of someone who suspects that perhaps their great-grandfather or a distant relative was a Nazi, they're coming forward with a name, with an address. What happens in those cases?
So people come forward to air their suspicions, but you also have people who call me, and this has happened more than once. People tell me they just had a fight with their 92-year-old neighbor who's a German, who's a terrible person, who must be a Nazi. So there are three tests. for the information. One is credibility. The information has to be credible. Just because someone had a fight or the neighbor is nasty doesn't mean he had to be a Nazi, obviously. Okay? But the second test is that the person is alive and healthy enough to be put on trial. And the third is that that person was never prosecuted previously. Now, but I have to explain one thing which perhaps will make it easier for our viewers to understand how difficult this is. The easiest way, the best way to work is the way the police works. They start with a crime, and then they try and figure out who committed the crime and the guilty party. But in our case, 99% of the people who committed the crimes of the Holocaust are no longer alive. So you can't work that way. You have to start with a tip about a person who's alive, healthy enough to stand trial, and may or may not have been a Nazi war criminal. And it's very, very difficult.
I can only imagine the challenges that you face, the time, the years that you spend in this pursuit, but we greatly appreciate your efforts and the efforts of the Simon Wiesenthal Center, and we truly owe you a debt of gratitude for this work that does not stop, and we appreciate your pursuit of justice. Dr. Zuroff, thank you so much for taking some of your time and sharing your vast experience with us on JBS. We really appreciate it very, very much and wish you continued success in this effort.
Thank you, Teisha. Thank you for having me on the show.
Thank you. Dr. Efraim Zuroff is the chief Nazi hunter of the Simon Wiesenthal Center and the director of its Israel office. We thank him for joining us here on JBS and for his years of work with the Simon Wiesenthal Center. Thank you, as always, to our director, Sloan Copeland, production coordinator, Serge Goldberg, JBS Associate Director, Dara Golub, and to our editors, Dennis Golan and Jonathan McDevitt. I'm Teisha Bader in for Mark Golub on this edition of In the News.